The 29th of May, 2022. Thanks for tuning in to my official YouTube channel. Make sure to subscribe to my official YouTube channel. Additionally, make sure to like my official YouTube videos and share the link to my official YouTube videos. If you are going to leave a comment, make sure to have etiquette and respect. Additionally, go to my website, www.susanmealing.com, which is the same as www.ladydorybell.com. I am going to bring forward in this particular moment a different viewpoint as to what is considered time. And so individuals who have various expertise in different fields would be capable to validate one way or another, though there are already quite a few validations that could be taken into consideration. So if you look at the picture that has been drawn out and shown in reference to the solar system and how the elliptical type of orbiting that the Earth rotates around the sun is in an actual, more of an oval type of shape in comparison. And if you take in consideration additionally as to the northern and southern hemispheres of the Earth. Now again, I didn't graduate basic training. I had a head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000 for the clarifications. And while I do not have a degree, obviously I acknowledge that, I have earned 26 individual scuba diving certifications. And before my head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000, when I was in basic training regarding the Army branch of the Armed Forces of the United States of America, I had done a lot of independent research in reference to science and many other factors. My biological father had been certified by the School of Bulova and was capable to work on a multitude of watches. One of my scuba diving certifications is regarding certified to work with Sunto computing devices and those particular pieces. The additional factors as to my biological mother having been in information technology and software engineering back in the 1980s and 1990s. And this particular official YouTube video of mine has to do with a video I had seen about the Apollo 11 mission. And if you look at certain points in the video, it brings up 1425, even though the publication date is at the time that it says, in reference to, while it says certain portions as to the 1994 aspect in the video, the mission to Apollo in history books, if I remember correctly, it was in the 1960s. So there are a few different viewpoints to take in consideration as to my particular theory to bring forward. So with the fact that the solar system has been drawn, as far as what has been seen, in more of an elliptical shape as to the Earth orbiting the sun, in conjunction to the fact that if you look up how many actual hours and minutes are in one considerable day, it's 24 hours, 59 seconds, or 24 hours, 59 minutes, and however many seconds. Well, here's a what if. What if, in reference to what is considered as the time frame where the equinox for the Earth is actually in reference to the polar ends of the longest points of the oval in reference to the elliptical shape. when orbiting around the sun. And maybe not necessarily the exact middle section of, though in that particular reference regarding time, what if during that point in time, those factors are something to equate, that because of the reality as to non-disclosure agreements regarding NASA and other space programs because of the time frames, what if that orbital plane around the sun is actually similar to the 24, or what is considered a day? So instead of 24 hours as most are accustomed to, it's 24 hours and the 59 minutes, however many seconds. In this particular theory, what if in reality 1 year, as far as what we consider a linear year, is actually doubled? So in this particular theory, as to the shape that has been drawn out regarding the solar system and the Earth orbiting around the sun, what if in that comparison, maybe it's 24 hours, 59 minutes, so on and so forth. So the arithmetic equation as to what linear time is, as we know through farmers' almanacs and so on and so forth, were to actually be a bit different. So with the calculations, instead of the 365 days for 1 year, well, what if that's one side of the elliptical orbiting to the sun? So in comparison from the halfway, so when the Earth is closest to the sun for this reference, and then the time frame around that half oval to the other side of the sun in the elliptical shape, though for the orbiting, that is considered the 365 days. And then the second half would be considered another 365 days. Because of the way the seasonal changes would be, it would be identical. And so in that particular reference, as to the orbital pattern of the Earth around the sun, the point of 365 days is when the Earth is closest to the sun on either side to the other side. And so obviously with the gravitational pull, that would translate to how the Earth would tilt on its axis as it would go around one particular portion of the orbital pattern for the Earth around the sun. In turn, with this particular theory, that would translate to what would be 365 days times 2 per year in that possible reference point regarding the theory. If that happens to be the case, obviously the astronomers who would pay attention to the different astrological alignments as to the planetary aspects as well as the stars would then have a different viewpoint because of the calculations as to the navigational points to pay attention to. And so if in this theory, in comparison to 365 days to go around the sun in a total around the sun, what if in this reference it was 365 days to only go around half? Those who know the spiritual significance to the infinity symbol, which those who don't, it's the number 8, though sideways. If you take a look at that in a different perspective, where the sun would be the central point, and the way you have the equal aspects as to what would be considered an oval as to the elliptical view, the possibility of, which, you know, for females or feminine individuals, well, you have the benefit of, by technicalities, cutting your age in half. By technicalities. So that would translate to, in half the amount of time, you would be capable to see that you could condense what you've done in a shorter amount of time. By technicalities. It would also translate to the other situations in that particular amount of time being condensed. However, it depends on your particular viewpoint and your perspective. So if in that particular situation where, in comparison to it being the year of 2022, well, it could be considered as, it could, in this viewpoint as to a hypothetical, to this theory, and then from progression forward as to the arithmetic as to how to actually calculate time, because those who have had the experience in reference to watches, such as my biological father, who had been a repairer and fixer of watches, as well as the jewelry portions, anybody who's in that particular field and or have had certain brands and or a specific type that the reference to how the hands still work knows that there are certain adjustments that have to be made. In conjunction to that, people who have had watches that have the day as well as the date to that chronological portion know that it's not as simple as the way it normally is viewed to reset the time. So in that viewpoint as to the watches that have certain types of combined factors and how many times it has to go in to be reset, and not in reference to the spring forward, leap back sort of situation, what if in those references it actually has to do with the polar magnetizing as to how certain watches are aligned. Same thing with clocks. And in comparison to it being a 365-day year, it's over 600 days or 700 days, whatever the actual number would be per year. And so the theory in that particular capacity would then translate to, if you multiply the number of 365 times 2, and I will simplify it in reference to the number 700, if you look into that capacity, then in the theory as to going on one half of the elliptical orbit, you would obviously have the 4 seasons. Well, as you went around the other half of that elliptical orbit, you would have the same type of 4 seasons. And yet, those who pay attention to seasonal changes regarding climate, there are certain years, so you have the every other year, where certain seasonal events occur in a certain way. So for example, the larger amount of snowfall, well, would that translate to when on one particular half of the elliptical orbit, it being every other year, that being in alignment to the actual viewpoint as to an elliptical orbit in comparison to a circular orbit around the sun. Individuals such as various astrophysicists would be far more adept to reviewing that particular reference. Same thing with scientific individuals as to the different fields of astronomy and space exploration. To that particular point, Would there also be because of the fact that the knowledge of when the moon orbits in the references of, if there are certain co-aligned aspects to take into consideration in reference to, because it's known, especially to law enforcement, whether they are local law enforcement, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and then military law enforcement such as MPs and CID, if they were to take a look in reference to the uptick during full moon and new moon time frame as to what their particular cases are, if there were to be individuals to look at not only that, but the review as to the time regarding that elliptical view, what certain similarities would be, especially in reference to how there are companies such as Blue Origin and SpaceX that have looked at going into further depths along the lines of NASA. And so with the situation as to how many more people have had technology available to them, and to ensure life preservation as well as progression forward in comparison to certain situations that have been proven over the historical time frame as to the mental health awareness and situations of, would that be something in this particular theory as to my lecture or monologue or sermon, depending on how you view it, as to something to consider? Because especially if there happens to be in that similarity to the new moon and the full moon that law enforcement would be capable to look at as to the situations they have dealt with, are there certain similarities that in that dual year time frame, so we have the 365-day reference point, so each 365 days in that dual or double aspect, are there certain things that in reference to 2020 can be noticed in the year of 2022, and would that be considered a 1 year time frame? What made me kind of think about this in a little bit more depth is having heard 44, President Barack Obama, from the speech that was on a video where he had said that it was a year time frame from the George Floyd incident. I remember George Floyd being in the year of 2020 in comparison to the year of 2021. So if in that capacity of that elliptical viewpoint as to the Earth orbiting around the sun, then would that in turn translate to the 2 years from two times 365 days to the consideration of? So if in that reference as to 365 days from the time frame we have called 2020, well, by technicalities that would be 2021. However, this is the year of 2022. So if in the year of 2022, and obviously those who would know far more than I would know as to what clearances the President of the United States of America and Vice President of the United States of America in conjunction to their administrations would have access to, similarly to certain areas of Congress and Senate and the Pentagon, would that be something as to a consideration? Because if in that particular reference as to what is considered an actual year that would be explained only to some, such as 44 when he was in office when the time frame up. So when you take in consideration as to how time has been measured and how it has progressed over the centuries and millenniums as to the knowledge of the general public, is this particular theory something to take in consideration? Because if that happened to be where anybody has had certain situations such as this. They are speaking with someone they know and or giving a speech in that particular reference, and when being off the cuff, such as in this particular reference of my lecture, which just for the knowledge of, there is not one official YouTube video of mine that I have done where there is a pre-written transcript, just so it's known. Everything is literally just directly from the source, however you particularly view that. And so while in earlier official YouTube videos of mine, I have shown some of the books that I authored and went over some of the details as to that knowledge for that particular time frame, and then made whatever additional commentary as per scene. There wasn't any transcript in that reference, similarly to right now in what is considered 29 May 2022. The facts are that this is in the reference to off the cuff. So in that regard, if as to 44, Barack Obama, having made a speech in the time frame of what currently is known as 2022, and let's say in that particular speech he gave, it was a smidgen off the cuff, where he just added a little extra, or he was asked a question. I acknowledge I didn't listen to the whole portion of, but if that was the case, and that particular situation came out and he said, oh, well, it's a year from the time of George Floyd, well, what is a year then? Because in the linear time frame of the 365 days, it would be 2 years. In comparison to if it's 365 days to the actual orbiting around the sun, then that would translate to, in 2022, being that 1 year point. And so if that's the case, because obviously as when he was President of the United States of America, that being the capacity of, when you take in consideration this year of 2022 as this point in time, well then would that translate to where with the knowledge of that 365 days to do the half version of the elliptical view to the other half being another 365 days to that equation. Because then, and I acknowledge I can't do the arithmetic, maybe there's somebody who can, especially in reference to that 24 hours, 59 minutes, however many seconds, as to if you multiply that by 2 to the 365 days, would that in turn translate to that elliptical viewpoint as to how, in comparison of the fall back, spring forward time aspect per spring and fall, again, would that be, if not the equinox portion, the situations as to which point would the elliptical be? Would it be where the elliptical orbiting of the sun in reference to the earth when it's standing on a perfect balance as to whichever day it is in each month of those 2 times, would that translate to the furthest distance from the sun in that elliptical, or would it be the 2 closest points as to the sun regarding that magnetic aspect? For those who were in elementary school at the same time I was, and others who may have had this, you may remember when some of the science teachers would say you could take an egg and sit it on a table at a specific point in time and the egg would stay standing. Well, in the common sense possibility, you could say in this theory that it would be when it's closest to the sun. And yet at the same time, would it be when it's the furthest from the sun due to the way it's known regarding the orbital pattern to take in consideration as to those factors? However, because of the 365-day point, would it actually be during the time frame of the 365-day orbiting? It would be on each pattern as to the halfway point to the furthest distance in the orbit from the sun. So when you take the reference to that elliptical shape or an oval shape, and not at the furthest distances as to what would be considered almost a point, and not to the portions in reference to the closest to the sun on each side for those 365 days, but at quarter points. So, or as far as the time frame when the equinoxes are. So in that equinox where it's turning in regards of the orbit, is that on each point the reference to the 365-day turning aspects as to the actual points of time per side. And so with 44 having said that, and whatever speech he was giving at the time, I had this as a child, where I would listen to different presidents or whatever aspects of, and certain things just didn't make sense to me. I've known about people who did that regarding movies, television shows. In my viewpoint, there was, the first time I remember this was, and I couldn't ever drop it. It always was a nuisance to me because everybody else had said, well, that's why are you caring about counting? Well, for those who remember, President Ronald Reagan had said the 4 scariest words are, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. Well, count out those words. I am here from the government, and I am here to help. That's more than 4. As a child, I was told I didn't know anything, and I counted. And so that's more than 4. Last I checked, just pointing that out there. Not the smartest crayon in the toolbox, not the sharpest tool in the shed. I acknowledge that at times. However, I'm fairly certain that is more than 4 words, mainly because there are 5 fingers on a hand. So, so whether you utilize I or I am from the, okay, so there's that. I'm just saying. So similarly as to 44 regarding the 1 year aspect, which it occurred in 2020 as to what the year was known at the time. But this is 2022, and that factor, would it be certain similarities as to the length of time, the amount of energy, the work, whatever as far as. So unlike how the Earth rotates as far as just in a 24 or whatever you consider a 1 day point in time, well, we know that on Earth. We can see that literally. So if in that reference of the rotation of the Earth at whatever elliptical portion of around the sun's orbiting around the sun, well, how would we know? unless there were actual measurements to take in consideration. And if that's the case, there are the realities as to how NASA would know, such as astronomers in addition, because they would be capable to take in consideration the maps as to the solar layout, as well as the astronomy regarding the stellar layout. And so if they were to look at, instead of the 365 day, if they were to elongate it to 2 times of 365 days, I'm sure that they'd probably find something different additionally to take in consideration. And so if that's actually the case in reference to this hypothetical theory, what would that then translate to, other than, well, we'd all be younger? That's definitely a fountain of youth right off the bat, depending on what you view as youth. And so when you take that in consideration as to condensing the time, so let's say, because it's 2022, okay, you've got 40-year-olds or people turning 40 this year who would then translate to being 20. Well, that works out for quite a few people when you take that in consideration. That translates to being younger by technicalities. And for those who have had the sensation and feeling that they didn't necessarily accomplish something beforehand, then you could take that as, well, you can, especially with those who like those participation trophies, well, you can condense that as far as what you've worked on in that time frame. And so, I mean, if you, and you can review that in that reference too, especially when you have the technological advantage of that viewpoint to assist additionally. So then you could take in consideration as to what you've accomplished in this particular reference of a 40-year, or technically 20 times of 365 days around one side of the orbit and 365 days around the other side of the orbit. Because why would it be, if in reference to listening and thinking about this to provoke different thoughts? Well, it's known about the dark side of the moon, as far as what has been discussed. So when you take in consideration of the dark side of the moon, which portion of the 365 day and 365 day would be considered for that reference point? Because if you add in the arithmetic of the 24 hours, 59 minutes, however many seconds, and instead of the spring forward and fall back portions of, and you multiply 365 times 2, but you also look at those leap years. Because why do we have leap years? Leap years weren't before a certain point in what is considered linear time at this point. And so you have an extra day. Well, why do you have an extra day, but still have to do the spring forward and fall back? If that's the case in regards to the arithmetic equation, why would you have to have a leap year? That's something I personally haven't been capable to understand. That has bothered me for a very long time. And so in those references of what is considered as leap year, and you add that, so 365 plus 366, and then would that translate to the arithmetic of an actual 24-hour time frame as far as the Earth's rotation as it goes in orbit around the sun. Those who have far better arithmetic skills than myself obviously would be capable to take that in consideration. So when you look into the references as to different countries, such as the United States of America, which has sent different space missions out to the moon, well, would it be during which 365-day time frame? So if it's actually 365 days, as far as the elliptical orbit around the sun, what was the capacity of for those mathematical arithmetic portions to this theory? So there's certain ones that have landed on the moon, and then you also have the observatories as to certain times of the year, and yet which time of the year? Would it be during what's considered the 365? And which side of the possibility regarding the elliptical or oval shape around the sun, which time? And so for the thought-provoking aspects as to this particular theory, in conjunction to space travel from Earth outward into space, I know there have to be situations that can be referred to that on Earth, the sending out of the technology piece, and then you have to calculate what specific time on Earth from what specific location as to the geographical portion as to time to send the signal to be capable, if it's out in space somewhere between whichever two planets, you have to do it by a certain time, otherwise within, it takes, I think it's like half an hour for one particular reference, and then the satellite goes and changes position and then moves towards a certain area. Well, what if the arithmetic to the time frame was actually that 365 times 2? Because what if in prior times it was sent out and at one point it worked perfectly, but then the second time they went to go and repeat it, it did it differently because of the difference as to which side of that elliptical orbit. And so instead of, for this example of a 30-minute, let's say when they did the 30-minute, they were actually closer to the particular area. And in comparison, the second time they went to do it, they were on the further side of the elliptical orbit. That consideration as to the arithmetic and how that could be recalculated would be something to consider. So, I'm sure there are males or masculine types that care about that age factor as well as females or feminine types. However, usually there are the females who keep that in mind, a smidgen more so than males, or masculine type in comparison. So if that's the case, that there's the 365 and 365, but the leap year is the distance as to both sides, as to the closer portion to the sun and or the further distance, however you view it, as to that, would that then translate to the arithmetic being recalculated in this particular theory as to what a year is considered as? Because when you take in consideration the leap years, and it's every 4 years, the equinox is twice a year, every 365 days. And so when you add those particular factors together, would that be that distance either closest to the sun and or furthest from the sun in this particular theory to consider. So, thanks for tuning in to my official YouTube channel. Subscribe to my official YouTube channel and leave a comment with etiquette and respect if you choose to do so. Share the link to my official YouTube videos. Subscribe, as I said, and go to my website, www.susanmeeling.com, which is the same as www.ladydoribell.com. Have a good day. This is, at this point in time, pun intended, 2/3 of a pun, possibly, nonetheless. This is the 29th of May, 2022.